Well, I've just wrapped up a lecture in Writing 303, Introduction to Rhetoric, and it was fantastic, and I had a great question in that class that I wanted to revisit in this video. And I can't exactly recreate I rather don't want to recreate the whole thread of where we were to get to that question, because it was a lengthy hour-long lecture that started with Hauser's ontology and a discussion of methodology in the sciences and humanities, and what is the methodology of rhetoric, and what methodology is Hauser using in his ontology and his construction of his philosophy of how the world is constructed with things, events, and processes. And then we discussed subjectivity and objectivity and some kind of classic philosophical problems, like if you are from your subjective experience, from your subjective position in reality, what can you verify to be true? And that's the solipsistic problem. You can't verify the consciousness of another human being, and this looks like physical reality. It looks like a physical object, and you can measure it, and it has some empirical qualities. It has properties to it that align with data that can be measured, or that you can construct data out of the properties of this object. But if you zoom into the atomic level, of course, there's actually quite a bit of space between the atoms that compose any material object in reality. And if you zoom even further down to the subatomic, you realize that things behave very strangely, and that's the basis of all the quantum exploration that we're doing. And we still don't understand a lot of that, and that's fine. But we see that there's a lot of unpredictability even in our subjective experience of reality when we look very closely. And there's unpredictability in objective reality too, like the placement of an electron. But what came up was this discussion of what is arbitrary and what is not. And I usually talk about capital for discussing what is arbitrary, because that seems to make sense to a lot of people. It's like money used to be backed by a gold standard, so it was an applicable value tied to something. Something that's arbitrary is human-made or human-invented. It doesn't necessarily have a direct relationship to the world. And this is part of Martin Heidegger's idea of like the house of language. So when you're born, you're brought into a language that already exists. A cat is a cat because we've called it a cat. And we kind of have a collective idea of what that is. It has 4 legs and it's fuzzy. But the cat that you imagine when I say that word is different than the cat that I imagine. It has a different color, maybe a different size, a different personality. So therein, that's where we get slippery, right? We can agree on certain words, but because they're fundamentally arbitrary, it's an invented representation, symbolic representation, verbal symbolic representation of a concept. It doesn't have a direct one-to-one relationship with reality. There's too much variation in what a cat can be and what we can imagine a cat to be. So a student posed a really interesting question. We're trying to work through what is a definition of arbitrary. And like I said, like money is largely arbitrary. We know because of the forces of a marketplace, we can assign values to objects in the world based on their demand and based on available capital and how many people are going to buy it at what price. That's how real estate functions. And the game of pricing out real estate is not an exact science. There's a little bit of an art to it, right? There's a little bit of an art to pricing out real estate, but you look at comparable properties and you gauge what you think people are going to pay for it, and that can vary quite a bit, and it has varied quite a bit over time. Like, what is real estate actually worth? What's a piece of dirt worth in the earth that's 50 by 150? You know, it's a city lot in this city. Most city lots are about 50 feet by 150 feet. Is it really worth $20,000? You know, it's like, so money in some sense is arbitrary, and also because it can be constructed out of nothing, right, on a computer at the bank. You can plug it into a spreadsheet and generate more capital out of thin air. It was a little bit arbitrary, but it does have some, and most of these things that we call arbitrary are a little bit sticky because they're grounded in reality. But the question my student had was, is time arbitrary? And I love that question. It's a wonderful question, and it's similar to money. It has these kind of sticking points. So Some parts of time are arbitrary. Some ways that we conceptualize time are arbitrary, and some ways that we conceptualize time are not arbitrary. They're rooted in astronomical reality. So a day is not arbitrary. That's observable reality. It's how long it takes the Earth to rotate once all the way around. And so we see the sun go up and come down and come back again. And that's a day. Now then we've broken that down into 24 hours, and then we've broken that down each hour into 60 minutes, and that into seconds. And I don't know the exact history there, but I think that those are arbitrary units that we've constructed, because we could break down the day into any number of ways. If we wanted to have 10 units of something that divide the day, that divide the absolute astronomical reality of a day, we could do that. We could do that fine and change the way that we look at it. The same thing with a week. A week does not need to be 7 days, and I don't think it will be 7 days forever. It's been 7 days for only so long. We've only been following the Gregorian calendar for so long. We've used different calendars throughout time, and different cultures use different kinds of calendars. So the week is arbitrary. A week of 7 days is arbitrary. And so are the hours and seconds and minutes. A month is roughly tied to the lunar calendar. A month is about 30 days, and so it takes the moon to go through its cycles that are observable. Now the number 7 has had religious significance and spiritual significance, and I don't know the history of the number 7, but I assume that that's why we have a 7-day week. And of course the names of the days of the week are tied to gods and goddesses and a variety of important figures. The names of the months, August after Augustus and July after Julius Caesar and these sorts of things. So it's like, yeah, arbitrary, absolutely invented by humans. But then what about the experience of time? And this is really interesting. So this goes back to this discussion about the distinction between objective reality and subjective experience of reality. And it's also a phenomenological question. Phenomenology, the study of how we, say, experience reality roughly. It's like a subfield of philosophy that I'm interested in. And time is interesting because it is a distinct property of the universe. It's a dimension of reality. Time exists. We're pulled along by time. You can't stop time. Time will always happen, and everything we do is bound by time and reality being tethered to time. We're being pushed along by time. And what we know as reality necessarily has time because it moves forward in this fashion. We might not understand time perfectly though, and that's some of the stranger things that come out of cosmology and theoretical physics show that time does strange, and this is Einstein's general relativity. Time might kind of actually shift and change a little bit, and certainly our subjective personal experience of time changes very much, and we know that there's a phenomenon called time compression that occurs as people get older. It's a fairly well documented phenomenon, something that people experience. Time seems to speed up as you get older. The days seem to pass more quickly because we have fewer novel new experiences. So the routine repetition seems to compress time, and your frame of reference changes because you've been around for longer, you're a little bit older, fewer things are newer, and the remaining, each new unit of time that you experience is shorter in relation to the total amount of time that you've existed. And all these things factor into time compression. So I thought this was just a fantastic question to ask in class and in relationship to what we were talking about, and it illustrates perfectly all the problems of defining what is arbitrary in reality and what isn't. So there's kind of this mixture of what is tied absolutely to reality and what isn't. And in language, there's so many. Some of our symbolic communication is really interesting because it's tied to reality and then it's not. So say the icon in so much software that allows you to save your progress in Microsoft Word, right? The little floppy disk icon that you click and you save your progress. In many applications, it's a floppy disk icon. It's a pictograph. Well, floppy disks aren't really a popular medium of storage anymore, so now it has more of a symbolic meaning than an actual, say, meaning tied to reality, even though it's still a historical artifact, but it's not something that's really in use anymore. So things can flitter in and out of being arbitrary or not. Language by and large is, and this is back to the Heidegger house of language. When you're born, you have a language pre-constructed for you. And so some of it is, our abstract concepts that we discuss, that we use language for. The majority of what I'm talking about right now, the language that I'm using is abstract and not necessarily tied to any kind of physical, tangible object, like a lamp over here or a plant in the background. That language, though, is closer. It's arbitrary in the sense that there's nothing about a plant that says it's a plant. If you went to another planet and you conversed with another species, it would only be coincidence if they would label that also a plant. That could only be coincidence, I think. There's nothing inherent about it that says it's a plant, other than we call it a plant, right? That makes it arbitrary. Okay, so some interesting ideas there about subjectivity and objectivity and what is arbitrary. But time is a necessary defining part of our reality, and it pulls us along. And that's interesting, right? That's very interesting. So our perception of time our perception of time and how we label time can be arbitrary, but it does have an absolute existence, it seems like. It's part of what defines our universe, though we don't fully understand it. The same way we don't fully understand light. The photon model, the wave model, the mixed model, the way it changes and how it changes in drastic circumstances, like when it enters the event horizon of a black hole. Strange things happen to light, and strange things happen to time as well, it seems like. So there's your mixture of rhetoric and philosophy and a little bit of my rudimentary grasp of physics there. But I just thought that was a brilliant question that a student asked and exemplifies what we discussed in the lecture very well. And the reason why it's important to discuss what is arbitrary in relationship to rhetoric, Hauser plays this out really nicely. I just really like this. He essentially says, or how I read Hauser is, rhetoric is what allows us to navigate what is arbitrary in the world. Arbitrary social situations, unpredictable social situations, like I've mentioned in another video. With great accuracy, you can use physics to calculate the trajectory of a projectile or something like that, Newtonian physics. But there's no equation to predict what's going to happen in discourse when people come together and talk. And so rhetoric is this kind of way of unraveling all those unpredictable, arbitrary, non-mathematical, say, subjective experiences in reality, and objectively what happens at a larger scale between people. So that's enough for today. It's Friday. I'm going to log out here and head out of the office. I had a great first week back to classes. I'm enjoying my classes, and I'm going to continue making some videos here to supplement my classes, and also just to post publicly to talk about some interesting ideas related to rhetoric and writing and language and the theory of language and philosophy. And thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves out there.